Welcome everyone to the Holy Sparks podcast. My name is Saul K. Super excited and grateful for yet another quality guest. And without further ado, let me introduce and edify the woman properly. Toba Hellerstein is a strategic advisor specializing in psychological and sociological approaches to communication, negotiation, and public perception. As the founder and CEO of Attune now, she helps governments, nonprofits, and institutions navigate complex global challenges through research-driven insights grounded in human behavior, emotional intelligence, and strategic analysis. With over 20 years of experience in high-stakes and strategic research, she has advised top global leaders on critical initiatives. She founded and led the Texas-Israel Alliance, an economic diplomacy organization, headed Stratfor's Middle East department, and established BridgeStars, a negotiation backchannel for Israeli and Arab leaders. Her work includes extensive collaboration with the Israeli government, shaping strategies at the intersection of policy, diplomacy, and public perception. Toba, welcome to the Holy Sparks podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure, and I'm super excited for our audience to get to know you and your brilliant work, of which I've been diving into this week. But before we dive into that, let's start a little bit with about where and how you grew up, specifically focusing on a Jewish lens.
Okay, well, so I'm from New York, so I'm from right outside of Manhattan in a place called Westchester, which I'm sure many of your viewers and listeners are familiar with. And I grew up in a conservative shul, very kind of prototypically American experience in a lot of ways. And yeah, I think with time, because I lived all over the world and I was educated in France, and I learned a lot later on that the experience of Judaism in America for, I think, most of Americans by the numbers of it is actually quite different than in other places. And I ended up really connecting a lot more with Judaism for me personally when I left the US, actually. It was a really different experience. So I think for me, like going back and looking and comparing, I'm like, oh yeah, I can see why this didn't feel like, I don't know, quite as spiritual growing up, a little bit like, I don't want to say sterile, that seems a little bit harsh, but yeah, and so I feel like in my adult current life, I've been able to kind of blend those things a little bit more. But my background was that, which I think is kind of yeah, I think it's more of a typical American experience. Yeah.
I love it. Okay, so you say you did mention France and other places in the world. So where's one place that you went to that you felt more resonance with Jewish, not only identity, but practice and as it relates to spirituality? I'm curious.
Yeah, I actually think that mm, it was pretty similar in every other place. It was really America was really the main exception, interestingly enough. So my first experience of this, so I lived in Morocco, and so I was in Morocco during high holidays. So it was kind of my first experience then. And then France, I lived there for many, many years. And I remember, I'll tell you a specific story. I remember the the shuls in France tend to be Sephardi, Mizrahi, and so I grew up, I'm Ashkenazi, and so it was just sort of a very different cultural lens. But I remember that there were these small, very simple rooms that were really filled up and crowded, but there was this raw animation that was actually really foreign to me in synagogue that I loved. I really loved it. It was messy. And I remember it was, oh, you know what? It was Purim. The memory I have was actually Purim, which is very fitting. Um, where one guy was dressed up in a rabbit onesie and they were lighting fireworks inside. And it was just, yeah, it was just this chaos that felt really beautiful. And I had just never, I think I was probably 20 at the time, and I had just never experienced that in synagogue before. And that just felt so much more, yeah, it felt more intimate. It felt more personal. I felt like I was able to access a level of spirituality that, I don't know, that was sort of allowed into that unpolishedness.
I love it. Yeah, I really feel like Judaism is like this wild, raw, um, untamed spiritual path, and we
Mm.
have boxed it into a nice package in the suburbs here, and I live in a suburb, so I'm also speaking to my environment that's very tame. And so, yeah, I think you absolutely nailed it. And Purim is one of the ways in which you sort of see that flower out, right, in some communities, which I think is incredible. Okay, so talk a little bit about, was there someone who modeled activism for you growing up, or was there certain influences that kind of led you on this path?
I have a memory of being like 7, and my grandfather, who was in politics in California for decades, I remember being at the dining room table in my home when they were visiting, and him asking me what I was going to do with my life in this very like interview, you better have an important answer. Um, and I don't know why, but that really always sort of stuck with me of life is not just about experiences, it's also about doing something purposeful and intentional. So it's not necessarily activism, but I think there were a lot of people around me growing up who were just so focused on making things happen in whatever environment they were in, like these little corners of the world where there was a lot of passion. Um, and the idea of, your career not just being like a job or a thing that you do, but some sort of passion project. I feel like that was really like I was totally immersed in that idea that your career was like pretty akin to why you're in the world in a lot of ways, even in a very like non-spiritual rationalist lens. Like it was still that same idea of those things merging. And so I don't know, there's sort of the initial examples or the initial kind of stories that come to mind. But it's funny when you use the word activism, it initially felt a little bit alien to me. It's just not a word that I normally interact with, which I guess is sort of silly when I zoom out. I guess that is what I do in a lot of ways. It's just not usually lexicon that I use. I think I resonate more with like passion and passion projects. It's sort of, which is, I don't know, so it kind of sounds like a semantics when I say it like that, but I'm just sort of stream of consciously explaining my reaction to it.
No, I get it. I think if when people, you get a fresh pair of eyes on what it is that you're doing and you different languaging around it, it's like, oh,
Mm.
that's how it's perceived. But I mean, when I read your article and when I read your blogs and you're blogging about Israel and Jews and how we can better do this life experience through
Mm.
actions, I read that as activism and not maybe in the classical lens of your as you're thinking about it, but for sure in the
Mhm.
best light. Maybe that word has a different connotation for you or different associations, but I think it's net positive. And
Yeah. Yeah, I think of the word whistleblowing a lot, I think. Like calling out unseen truths and yeah, no, I do resonate with that of like uncovering truth with a capital T in areas where it's somehow really difficult to see because there's darkness or shadowing over it. Yeah. No.
and that as activism is what you're saying, as in your own definition of how it works for you, or more categorizing of what it is that you do.
I think it's probably technically activism. I've just never really interacted with that term before personally. Yeah, just sharing a little bit of like how I would orient to that work. It feels very and it does feel spiritual. Like it definitely feels spiritual because tr truth of the capital T is inherently spiritual, right? It's like kind of carving out these areas where like light can come through.
I like that idea of carving out areas where the light can come through. Our podcast is called the Holy Sparks Podcast, and that's exactly what my intention was in beginning this, which is there's this Kabbalistic idea of, the tzimtzum of the world, and all of these hidden sparks of holiness were kept in these kalim and various things, which but it's always good to repeat for the audience. 2 years later, we're still doing the same thing, right? And we're just uncovering it in different ways in different genres. And that's one of the reasons why I want to expose people in different sort of niches to other people, and because America is very denominatedly divided and
Totally.
people are cloistered in different echo chambers. So I want to, part of the reason of doing this whole thing from a meta reason is breaking that open. And I think that actually relates to a lot of what you're doing as well. So talk about your organization Attune now and how it started and what your vision is for it.
Yeah, so I'll zoom back a little bit further even. So my background is in intelligence and diplomacy, and you give a brief bio, but basically what became very clear throughout all of these different domains is how this is all centered around understanding humans, understanding how humans think, connect with the world, orient how humans change their minds, and how this is all about attuning to other people's experiences. And you kind of can't see this in any stronger way than in political negotiations, right? I mean, when you're trying to get someone to agree to something that they would normally not agree to, you're looking for the deeper truth under an initial no reaction. And that requires understanding where that no came from, right? And understanding what the origins of that were. And basically, it's like, how can I give you something you need, which is different than the thing that you're claiming to want or demand, right? And it just really it requires so much connection to people. And so it kind of started there. I started using this lens through that, and then after October 7th, I, like most Jews, kind of, stopped in my tracks. And I had been focusing on Middle East diplomacy work at that time. And this was sort of under the assumption that America was fine. So, working on like Abraham Accords and things like that, like I wouldn't, it's not whipped cream. It's super important, but like, your fundamental ally in the world is pretty foundational. And so seeing that feel like that was on fire, that got me really focused on understanding what was happening in the US and how to change that. And so there's all these different initiatives that formed because everyone was sort of hair on fire. What's happening? This felt kind of maybe not out of nowhere, but it was a larger reaction and a larger phenomena that people had expected, and organizations were not prepared for this. Government, right? No one was prepared. So I was in all of these different initiatives and collectives to try to figure out how to solve this problem. And what I noticed was time and time again, I was looking at, what does the research say, in terms of what do Americans know and think, and kind of, you want to start with that. You want to start with foundationally, what is truth, as opposed to what do we hope is true? What do we think might be true? What kind of feels true? And what I found was that there was not only was there no real body of work on this to draw on, there was like a strange amount of, I wouldn't say disinterest, but there wasn't a lot of motivation to figure it out. And so I, at the time, had still been running this organization, this, economic diplomacy organization. And I had decided that I wanted to take this on and this, figure out orienting to what do Americans see and know, and understanding the phenomena. So Attune now was sort of born in the same realm as the research, and working on all these different initiatives and figuring out, okay, if I want to do work in where my particular, I hate the word superpower. I feel like it's so overused. But there's things that you're very competent in. I struggle with the language around superpower or gift because you're just channeling something else, right?
True.
So, and so I think that this is an area where, seeing the unseen and being able to understand what's going on beneath the surface, for whatever reason, I'm able to access this in a pretty powerful way. And so I wanted to focus on that, not just areas that I had been trained in and was confident in and had experience in. Um, so that's kind of the origins of Attune now. And within that, when it comes to the research, I don't want to kind of proceed this. I'm sure you were going to ask, but I'll just sort of share, is I decided to take this on of figuring out and doing the first comprehensive study on understanding what do Americans know about Jews in Israel, what do Americans think of Jews in Israel, and then also what are things that help them change their minds, right? Not just like, how do we track anti-Semitic incidents, or how do we kind of track Americans' perception of anti-Semitism or what they think of anti-Semitism? I mean, it's pretty academic and kind of it's a degree or two removed from the problem, right? And so I wanted to really understand what was actually happening. And so, yeah, so I decided I set out to do this study, and this is, all these different layers. These are focus groups, it's ethnographic research, it's social media, discourse analysis research, layering that together and understanding what's going on in society. And, I think we all know, but it was interesting to see in real time. We all know that anti-Semitism is a symptom of a cultural problem. We've heard this from historians and people, throughout time, but it was so incredible to watch that unravel in the research. It's like there's a difference between knowing something conceptually and really intimately feeling the texture and smelling it and like really engaging with it directly. Of like, okay, you have, the rise of populism, you have the meaning crisis and the loneliness crisis, right? You have all these different things. You've got this contempt towards institutions and anger um, towards haves and have-nots, right? And I've had these like epiphanies going through this of, oh wow, like, yeah, this is exactly what's always happened. These patterns are so rinse and repeat and like tracks through cycles of how civilizations and societies ebb and flow, right? Anyway, so, but to answer your original question, none of that is possible without attuning to people as individuals, society and culture overall. And I think that kind of attunement requires, I mean, it requires curiosity, right? Because if you're operating from a sense of anger and judgment, which was very hard for me to put aside, right? I'm human, right? So it was such an emotionally grueling thing to put that to the side for this work. But if you don't operate under curiosity, you're not going to figure out what's happening. And the really, I don't know, bizarre is the right word, but the interesting thing about curiosity is, it inherently you have to have some compassion for who you're studying, right? Because if you're really curious about someone's experience, you're connecting with them as a person. And so it puts you in this very interesting, I mean, for me, this is not foreign because I've been doing work around jihadism and, Arab-Israeli diplomacy. So I'm accustomed to being in that space. But I think talking about the research to people and explaining it, I think requires people being in that curiosity a bit in a way that I think is a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, Nahan, absolutely. Well, real quick, I will name the over 100-page report. I believe it's 139 pages. It's called Perceptions of Jews in Israel, Narratives of Anti-Semitism, Insights and Strategies for Change. And you can download it on Attune now, yeah?
Yes, and it's totally free. There's a lot of there's a lot of initiatives that have happened in the last couple of years, especially where research with gatekeeping and things like that. And I have a very like you can't patent the sun kind of mentality. So yeah, this is free and accessible to anyone. I didn't want to make a book and sell it. I wanted this to be available
I love it. It just came out, or last year? When did it actually come out?
a couple weeks ago.
A weeks ago. Okay, amazing. How has the response been so far? What have you noticed?
What I have noticed is I think I thought that it would have been a little more controversial is what I was anticipating. And so far that has not been the case. It's been incredible. The people who have interacted with the work have had this like, holy crap kind of response of like, I was sort of sensing this, but I didn't know how to put it together. It's the sort of the insights that come from this. These are not like academic pie in the sky. It's the sort of thing that it's these, you know, it's this common sense that's lurking in the shadows, where as soon as you hear it, you can't unhear it. And so it's had this really like penetrative, profound effect on people who have interacted with it, which has been for me amazing because that was my experience with it. So it's always really nice to have everyone else have that experience as well. But yeah, I've had incredibly positive reactions around also this was a lonely process in the beginning, right? Because no one had done this work. No one seemed to think that this was important work to do, even if they said that. The actions didn't necessarily show it. And and now that it's done, getting the reaction of like, where has this been? We needed this the whole time, which has felt really, which has felt really kind of healing for me to feel like I'm syncing up with the community on, yes, this is important. So I've been really elated by that. I think my background and career is in back channeling. So it's very new to me to think about things of, publicly promoting work like this. But the truth is, this is something that's so important, not just for Jewish organizations, but the Jewish community in general to understand what's happening. And so I think what's been interesting about this is it's been a lot easier to get organizations and big leaders involved because it's a little bit more kind of strategic in that way, and they're using that and incorporating it in their work. But what's really powerful, which I'm looking to do now, is having a sense of having Jewish community in general have visibility about this, because I think that in some ways it can be discouraging, but I think a lot of the insights are quite energizing because I think they provide a lens of understanding what's happening in a way that doesn't feel hopeless or necessarily even inevitable, which feels which feels a little bit life-giving during a time where things feel like they're just falling apart and collapsing.
Okay, great. Yes. And my experience of reading it, even the top level summary, is like I've been thinking these things as well, and someone actually languaged it in a way that makes sense. So you definitely channeled what was actually happening. So I can vouch for that for sure. And there's a couple terms and a couple things that you brought out that I want to unpack a little bit and explore. So one of the terms, which maybe you coined this, I'm not sure, Zionist privilege. Maybe that's an original. So talk about that and how you came to that, and then since it's related to universities, the way that I read it, how we can begin to turn this 20 plus year tide of anti-Semitism and funding in American universities and abroad.
Totally. Yeah. So anti-Zionist privilege was something that I came up with early on in the research because most of my research, um, the focus groups were with working class people. And there was this incredibly stark contrast between the way they interacted with this conflict and understanding about what was happening and what you would see on college campuses, which is pretty, widely portrayed in the media. So the idea of anti-Zionist privilege is that it requires a high threshold of your needs being met and comfort in your life for you to hyper focus on a conflict that has nothing to do with your daily life, right? So you find this in arenas where people are interested in sort of abstract ideas about the world, where you often see a disconnect between pragmatism and theory. And so academic environments are obviously really rife with this, where people have this spaciousness, and it is a privilege to be able to play with thoughts of like, and by the way, like Marxism is very similar to this, right? It's a really interesting thought, but it's very disconnected from practically what happens in real life, right? Pragmatically. So it's sort of a really good example of this, of interest in playing with ideas and not being really, not having the burden of dealing with the impact or reality of those ideas, right? You're living in a country with freedom and you benefit from all of those different things and you can get to play with these different ideas. And in the same token, you get to have this really cushy, comfortable life in America where, for most people, and certainly Gen Z and America and millennials, but actually, wait, even older generations, the concept of war is distant lands. It's not it's not you feeling unsafe in your home, which by the way is another privilege. That's another American privilege, right? Is knowing that you can have stances about the world that have nothing to do with you defending your family or going to the grocery store, right? And that would be that I call that one safety privilege, right? So for anti-Zionist privilege, so it's the engagement of places that you're not connected to as sort of pawns. It's actually quite objectifying for Palestinians even, which I think is actually really interesting. It's a form of, you're projecting your own American experience on distant lands, which is incredibly narcissistic, actually. And interestingly enough, the people who tend to do this are often very vocal at Americans being too insular and not really understanding the world, but they're doing the exact same thing, right? It's a very superficial engagement with other places. And so, yeah, it's this privilege of like, we're going to opine and have opinions on what should be done. And we are not responsible and we carry no burden for any of those consequences.
Right. I was fortunately and unfortunately on UC Berkeley campus from August 2023 through August 2024. And like you hear these kids, 18, 19-year-olds saying, globalize the intifada, like having no idea what that actually means or what the actual repercussions or that they themselves would probably be a victim of what they're saying, right? So, yeah, it's definitely a disconnect from reality. So one thing that you named as well, which I've was piping on about while I was at UC, which is all of this money that's come in for the last 20, 30 years from Qatar and other these places, funneling into universities and how to, and I experienced I was in Middle Eastern studies, right? So I experienced a lot of misinformation in classes and frequently would standing up and trying to present other narratives. But it's such a huge tide moving things in a certain direction, a certain narrative. What are your thoughts in terms of solutions for at least beginning the process of change?
I mean, the truth is that's a level where it has to be policy to some degree because by the numbers in terms of funding and geopolitical interests, it's not just places like Qatar. It's also in different ways. I mean, obviously academically it would be very Qatar heavy, but on social media, all of the different spending that's coming in and the interest from China and Russia, who don't have an ideological gain here, right? This is about geopolitical games between, sowing dissent and problems in America. So in all of these areas where you're going to be outspent, it has to be policy driven, right? You can't allow for foreign countries with nefarious interests to be giving unlimited amounts of money to universities. And that has, and unfortunately, I'm not a huge, I think things that can be done organically is always better. But in this sort of way, a university is going to be incentivized, if they're incentivized to procure grants and funding, and nefarious actors are the ones who are willing to write the biggest checks, the only solution there is to not allow them to do that. And so, yeah, I think it's not a very, I don't think it's a very radical answer. I think this is kind of the consensus at this point. But, by the numbers, Jews in the world, it's very, very small. And so, even if we were as wealthy as people think that we are, we just can't outspend. You
Right.
can't outspend on social media. You can't outpost, right? We just don't have the numbers. We don't have the scale for that. And so at a certain point, there needs to be, and I think this is obviously happening to some degree, but it has to be a recognition of like, what are American values and interests? And we have to kind of have policy and regulation that sort of upholds that. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think, universities, I think there's all these different ways that this problem manifests. I think, when it comes to accepting grants from different actors, it's sort of like, okay, well, the system's sort of designed like that. You sort of expect that to happen. And then there's other ways where it was totally discretionary and they just clearly did not feel like helping the Jewish students out. There's kind of different buckets here, right? So like they could have theoretically taken grant money from Qatar and had really anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, curriculum and still protected students on campus, right? They could have done that. So you kind of have things coming from different angles. So you have the mismatch of interests between, let's say, the next generation of Americans and the university that is trying to fundraise. And then you have the university feeling very cowardly towards political pressures and radicalization. That means that they're not protecting their Jewish students. And so you have just all of these different pressure points that come together in this really nasty situation overall.
Okay, so speaking of outspending, so I live near the 101 freeway, and a bunch of friends of ours in community got we changed a very anti-Semitic billboard to, we picked a Jubalong because they had the whole infrastructure to do something. So I want to hear your perspective on billboards, both from kind of from both sides, and also curious about the pink billboard strategy. Is that actually working? Did you encounter that in your groups? And what are your thoughts about that?
So I didn't, I mean, my groups were not in areas where those pink billboards were. So I don't have any, I don't have any research findings related to that. I mean, to me, to be honest, billboards, it's another platform. I think there's so many different ways to engage. I don't have a particular view on billboards. I have particular views on the content and language and imagery that would be used, whether it's on social media, on wherever the platform would be. I think that, and I think that this immersive strategy that the other side has done is they're incorporating every aspect. It's like, okay, we're going to get different types of stories into books and movies, and we'll have social media posts, and we'll have billboards, and it will align with other domestic groups. They have this multi-front, um, really multifaceted strategy, and that is the way to do it. So, billboards, sure. But I think more importantly is what is the messaging? And that's really what my research is about, is what is effective messaging, not just what feels cathartic for us to either write or read. And the truth is, and I talk about this a lot in the research, is we have a big echo chamber problem for a lot of reasons, where Jews tend to be very disconnected from what do normal Americans think, feel, and know. And because we have that disconnect, we really struggle to know how to use language and messaging that would change hearts and minds. And so, what I see a lot, because I see many different initiatives, whether it's social media or elsewhere, where it's the sort of content that me as a Jewish person and as a Zionist, it feels really good, but it doesn't move the needle.
Like, let's take an example. I have similar reactions to what you just mentioned, right? Zionist, Jewish person, I'm like, yes, someone's doing something. This is great. So I don't totally understand how it feels. I mean, I'm also a first generation immigrant to America, so I don't have this, multi-generational American experience. So for example, we see a pink billboard. It says, Hamas is your problem too. So I see that, I'm like, yeah, but I have no idea how Americans, a typical American would view this, and if that even registers, right? So just curious about your thoughts about that.
What I'd actually like to do, because I don't I think there are so many people who are trying to do this work, and I think that there are so many good intentions. I'd rather just go through what does work
Sounds
overall.
great.
And any platform could kind of incorporate this. It was very hard for me to distill this down. I have kind of 10 main points that I can go through. Tells a very small slice of the picture, but these are sort of the most actionable ones. So the first one is using accessible language. So this is about avoiding specialized jargon, assumptions about what the audience knows. So people, even words like Zionism, even words like anti-Semitism, you would think that these would be kind of common lexicon, but people don't always hear these words in the way that we hear them. And so even that so for example, for the word Zionist, so you'll see lots of messaging around Zionism. It does not land I mean, it has a huge negative connotation, but even if it doesn't, it's very neutral. It doesn't land. However, talking about Jewish homeland, saying that it's the only country in the entire world that's a Jewish country. Jews have been kicked out of every other country, and it's this small, small place where we can feel safe. And you'll get most American support from that, right? But I think insisting that they have to like the word Zionism, I mean, that was just a word that we made up, right? This is not anti-Semitism, by the way, was a word that was made up by anti-Semites in the late 1800s, right? And we ended up using, but these are all just words, right? So I think focusing on people understanding the point as opposed to the language. So that's kind of the first one. It's using accessible language. And by the way, like the word Hamas, a lot of people will know what that means, but it doesn't fill people's hearts with fear in the way that it would for us, right? So I think, words around like terrorism and things like that, those are words that Americans can relate to more. But by the way, it's not really young Americans. So Gen Z, they didn't grow up with, September 11th. Right. So they're not as familiar with this. And so there's also these generational differences where there's some language that makes a lot more sense to older generations than younger generations. So that's the first one. The second one is the name of the game is humanization because anti-Semitism is all about dehumanization. So what that means is messaging and communications that are speaking through relatable stories about Israeli and Jewish families and everyday experiences. And a lot of what this requires is understanding what are Americans' top positive perceptions of Jews because you would want to tell stories and humanize in ways that are swimming downstream. And Jews tend, let's actually try this out. Let's do a little experiment.
Let's do
What
it.
do you think would be the best quality of Jews that Americans would think of? If you said, what's the best thing about Jews? What would Americans say, you think?
Two things: belief in family and education.
Okay, so you're 50% on it. So most Jews will say education and things like achievement, like helping the world in different ways. No one cared. No one cared at all. Okay. This didn't even show up. I have like a top 10, didn't even show up. Um, smart could show up, but smart also went into manipulative. So it had a downside. Family values, though, that the two biggest ones were humor and family values. And the two great things about those is they don't have a downside. So some of the positive traits do. So a lot of people had great things to say about Jewish community, tight-knit community, right? Because America has a huge loneliness and isolation problem. So Americans really value that. But what's the problem? The problem is that you have this downside of perceiving Jews as insular. So you have to be really, really careful about that one. So there's different qualities, and depending on the audience, you have different ideas of these perceptions. So, for example, Jews with money. If you tell Latinos, and I've cross-verified this with other groups that do amazing work on Latinos, because my segment is just my segment, and they confirmed this, is that when you say Jews are good with money, they're not thinking about Jews controlling banks in the world. They're thinking about Jews being hardworking. Okay. And actually, that's another one. Hardworking is a really strong positive trope too that doesn't really have a negative side. It can at times about Jews caring about work or money too much. It can have, but it's less prone to that. Whereas so Latinos will tend to think about Jews as money as positive, success, hard work. You talk to Black Americans, though, and they tend to have more conspiratorial ideas about Jews and money that doesn't relate to hard work, right? So it's really contextual of which communities are receiving what types of information and have different sorts of associations. So anyway, all this is to say, for the second point about humanizing Israelis, you want to leverage the positive traits that most Americans already have, right? And telling stories that kind of highlight that. The third one is about telling our story, whether this is Jewish history or Israel, through universal storytelling. So this is like instead of talking about the specifics of the war or the conflict, you want to use themes that are universal. So it's like survival, love of family, commitment, loyalty, right? Bravery, um, striving, even if you're imperfect, you keep on trying to be better, right? These are so human and universal. And so being able to, when we want to talk about what Israel is doing, you want to talk about this in this universalist lens. Partially because one of the big findings is that there's a huge knowledge gap between what we think Americans know and what Americans know, and you're never going to overcome that knowledge gap. This is the kind of the crisis of American education. We're not going to solve that. And you don't need to because people have gotten very animated about Palestinians without knowing really much about them. So it doesn't actually require that much knowledge, interestingly enough. So telling this universalist story is so important. And by the way, you know, we like to talk about achievements and concrete actions as opposed to this human experience of like, why are we doing it? Right. And this is actually really important because when you talk to Americans about Israel and let's say the war, it's not effective to defend actions that were taken, but what is effective is to talk about what we're trying to do and why. And this is what we've tried. And maybe it's not the perfect solution, but we don't really see a better one. Do you see a better one? Right? So, not focusing so much on defending the thing, because the thing is always imperfect. It's government, it's war. This is all very messy stuff. It's like kind of an undefendable thing, right? But what you can defend is we can't not get our people back. Like it's like when you talk about the why, that's so much more resonant than really defending the what. And people will give you so much leeway for the what if they really identify with your why.
Hmm.
So that's the third one about universal. The fourth one is about breaking out of the echo chamber. So I talked about using accessible language, but it's more than that. There's pictures and concepts and words that we'll use that for us, because we have so much other context, they are emotionally resonant. And we think that we're communicating in this emotionally resonant way. But if someone doesn't have all that context, it's going to fall flat. So this is understanding what would actually connect with people if you acknowledge that they don't have all this other information. The next one is about addressing US cultural context. And so, anti-Semitism manifests as this is scapegoating, right? This is not a word that we use in America nowadays as much around anti-Semitism, which is interesting because as soon as use the word scapegoat, everything kind of becomes very clear. It's like somehow Israel is the stain of history, of the evil of the world. It's somehow the whitest country, right? Somehow Israel's the whitest country, the biggest archetype of colonialism, right? And all these different things. It makes sense once you realize, oh, Americans are really angry at different institutions and power, right? And then you can kind of interpret it in that lens. So understanding the US cultural context helps you segment why people have been bought in, and it helps you understand how to bring them out. Because if you don't understand how they arrived there, like if someone arrived in this because they are, let's say, anti-capitalist, want to defund the US military, and Israel is seen as a symbol of that, right? The scapegoat of your US grievances. Debating about the war doesn't do anything. That's not how they arrived there, right? And so you have to segment this out in order to know how to win people over. And so a lot of this involves understanding what US culture has created. The next one is about understanding Jewish collective trauma. So the Jewish collective trauma response. So basically, this works on individuals in the same way that this can work over time on communities of if you experience something horrible, earth-shatteringly terrible, what's the best way to cope? You kind of shut down your emotional responses, right? It's a way to self-protect. And humans are very, very bad at selectively feeling things. We kind of are on or off. So what happens over time is you see Jewish culture tends to be hyper rationalist, hyper logical, right? We focus on facts and debate and convincing. And all of that is a way to not be vulnerable because vulnerability is painful. But what's the problem there? The problem is that to humanize and to get people to have compassion for our experience, we have to emotionally connect. And you can't fake that. That requires us being in the emotional rawness and communicating from that place because humans are very smart and can feel if you're doing that or not. So, that's the next one is basically this is the reason why you don't see a lot of emotionally resonant communications. The next one, which is kind of related, is having messaging that's authentic and organic. All of this like polished branding. You have videos that like are produced from an organization and their logo is on the video, right? Well, Americans are very sensitive to we're in the age of misinformation. Americans are very aware of that. So everyone's looking to see what's propaganda. So we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. And the other side, very well funded, very well coordinated, but they're making it look organic, right? Which looks sort of more genuine. The last one is engaging in the second to last. So engaging in pop culture and understanding how to engage in coolness, which sounds like this very like, what is cool? There's actually kind of a science to it. So in the study, I mapped this out of like, what are the elements of cool? And it's so illuminating to look because you go one for one and you're like, oh, the anti-Israel propaganda machine, this pro-Palestinian propaganda, one for one is like 100 out of 100 on cool, and we're like almost at zero at every single category. Okay, so it's sort of like it's no wonder that this is becoming very viral with young people. There's a fabric to this. It's not even an art. It's actually a science. And so that's kind of exciting because I'm naming all these opportunities for us to do something different, right?
So,
These
for
are all
example, like sorry to interrupt you, but dovetailing on, you say there's a fabric to it. Yeah, it's called a keffiyeh, which is a borrowed item, and
Yeah.
so that is one of your examples, right? Of what's cool. It's countercultural. It's anti-establishment. It's this. It's a piece of cloth, whatever that was taken from Iraq and 3,000 years ago. So we need what's the Jewish version of that? I mean, people wear Stars of David. Doesn't exactly sort of
No.
get there, right? So what do you?
No, it has to be so the reason why the keffiyeh is so popular is because it's a sign of rebellion. So it's sort of like the Che Guevara shirt, right? It's like all these different symbols of rebellion throughout time because rebellion is cool. So a Star of David is not rebellious. It's not cool, right? So this is the thing, right? So you have to really go through this rubric of understanding the different components before even getting there. And by the way, it's like I don't know if I don't think we fully talked about this, but like even when you look at slogans like Free Palestine versus Stand with Israel, Free Palestine is so brilliant because I don't need to know anything about Palestine. I know I like freedom. But with Israel, you have to already care about Israel. Like, you're not supporting standing. Like, what does that even mean? Right?
Hmm.
So, we're not communicating in a way that brings people in who are not already bought in. The last one I'll talk about is archetypes, which is so, so important. So, basically, we often don't realize this. This is very Jungian, but we often don't realize this, but we really perceive the world through archetypes. The idea is like throughout time and culture and history, there are these like reoccurring roles of like sorcerer, king, joker, right? These like different roles that will be played in different ways. And you look at mythology or you look at Star Wars, and it's all the same, right? These are all very similar roles. So the Palestinian propaganda has perfectly harnessed this, and they have this amazing dual archetype of the innocent victim, which is the Palestinian people, and the anti-hero, which is Hamas. So what's so brilliant about this is whether people are bought in through compassion or they're bought in through anger, they have an archetype for that. And the other thing that's really brilliant about this is that you have an archetype for people and for government, which means that you will still have compassion for the people, regardless of review of the government. And even more important is archetypes are such an important part of America today. I mean, we see this throughout. We see the guy who shot the United CEO, Donald Trump, whatever your politics are, you're seeing anti-heroes everywhere. And it's because anti-heroes come when you have so much anger and distrust and contempt for institutions that you think that we need someone who's ugly enough that they can go toe to toe. And in fact, the ugliness of the anti-hero is really the reflection of that is on who they're rebelling against. they're actually not burdened. They don't hold accountability for their ugliness. They had to. How else could they fight this horrible, corrupt, terrible thing? So they're really shielded from criticism, which is why they can rape and torture and do all these things. And we're losing our minds of, well, at some point, someone has to say, wait a second, this is too much. But that's not what an anti-hero is. An anti-hero is allowed to do this, right? But Israel, the only archetype for Israel is the king, the ruler. So this is stability and power. And this works so well if you are lobbying Congress and you want to have partnerships with military, you want businesses to invest because you want stability. Well, it works great for that. But we've never had a Gen Pop engagement strategy. The Jewish community has only really worked with like, okay, we're going to have secure relationships with key stakeholders. We've never done this general consumption of what do people think of us. And so we don't have an archetype for that. And so the problem, the huge liability is that what does the king archetype do? It conflates people and government. And if Americans don't like government, there's no, even if they liked the Israeli government, they're still not going to like it because they don't like government, right? So, and there's no way to humanize people if you think that they're this abstract monolith that's just about power and government. You see how this sort of so we're kind of uncovering the skeleton of why what is happening is happening.
Absolutely. Well, I remember studying the archetypes a long time ago when it was first presented to me as, king, warrior, lover, magician, and they're sort of like shadow arc, lesser versions, right? So, do you think people relate more to lovers, magicians, warriors? Because when Israel is strong, they're hated. When they're weak for 6 hours after October 7th or during, we had 5 hours of compassion and that disappeared the next day. So is there an archetype that, you feel besides the anti-hero, or maybe it's that would really actually be effective?
So we need an art, and I have one. I did a lot of work on this. So we need an archetype that does two things. We cannot use the anti-hero archetype because you then jeopardize all of these important relationships with institutions in America, government, companies, strategic relationships. So, that does not work for us. The key with the archetype for us, and it's a bit of a nuanced one. So I'm not just taking a totally generic one. I'm sort of giving a bit of a nuanced model. I call it the flawed hero. So the flawed hero is about your cause is noble in the same way that an anti-hero could be, right? So the cause is noble, but as opposed to saying we're this rebel that will burn things to the ground to accomplish this, instead of saying that, you say our cause is noble, we care about our people, we will get our people back. We're going to make mistakes and we're going to try to do better and we're human and we're imperfect.
Like
And
everyone in the Torah. Great examples. Yes.
if you look at Americans actually really love this admission of imperfection. Americans are very not only tolerant of that, if you look at the most beloved characters in America, it's people who have these huge flaws.
Mm.
So part of the problem is us whitewashing and pretending that what we're doing is how can it be perfect? It's a war, right? There's nothing perfect about war. It's impossible. And so we're playing this losing game to act as though that were true because first of all, people are not stupid. They know that's not true. And second of all, we're then aligning ourselves with an action and not the motivation for why, right? So we need to be we have to have an archetype that's prioritizing the why. So hero, when we talk about hero, this is about courage and loyalty and grit and survival, right? And how heroic that is, and not just in terms of protecting your community, but like the courage of like showing up and being human and getting pushed to the ground and getting up again, right? And that's something that Americans love and respect and owning the flaw of it, right? And I think that, and you'll notice this in so many contexts in your life, is that if you're the first one to acknowledge the flaw, it really de-weaponizes it from your opponent, right?
Yeah, of course.
And I think this is another segment of the study, is what you often find in American Jewry is you have these two extremes where people will either fall into the camp of being extremely defensive in terms of like, I'm going to, I don't just mean defensive, I mean like defending everything that Israel does as though you were the MFA or a spokesperson, or being so apologist, you're giving up what actually matters and you're losing your integrity. And neither one of these strategies works, by the way, because the first one, people don't trust it because it's not reasonable. This is just not no one's perfect. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't pass the sniff test. And the second one, people think you have no integrity and they already have this, there's already this negative stereotype of Jews being untrustworthy or like weaselly. Nothing sounds more like that than abandoning your people and saying that, we should just kind of give up the game, right? This is, and so a lot of Jews will think, and this is a trauma response as well, is saying, I'm not the bad kind of Jew. Please don't come for me. Like I'm against everything Israel does. I'm pro-Palestinian. I'm the good Jew. Please don't victimize me.
That's
And they think
assimilation.
yeah, and they think, well, definitely assimilation, but it's a self-protection of like, exactly. It's like I'm not part of this bad group. And people think, and I have compassion for Jews who do that because it's a way to not be vilified and to not bear, they think it's a way to not bear the brunt of the anti-Semitism. And the truth is it's not true because no one really believes you. No one
Right.
believes that you don't actually care about your people. No one believes that.
I heard someone recently talk about, we talk about the fight and flight response, that there's actually a third response, which is freeze, which I think is actually
Fawn.
exactly,
Fawn.
or
This one,
fawn.
fawn.
So I think it's the similar thing you're talking about, and it doesn't work for you or
That's
other people, and people completely lose respect for people who
That's
do that.
that's a really, really good point. So it's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And you're exactly right. This apologism, it's fawn. And the defensive one is fight. That's 100% right. Yeah.
Okay, so a couple thoughts I had, and definitely rewind the tape and listen to everything she just said because it's very dense content, and there's some definitely actionable items and things to think about. Okay, so what I hear you saying, Toba, is all of these ideas and 8 to 10 bullet points are how to reframe this narrative for Americans, right? From the perspective of what would speak to the American heart and spirit and aspiration. Okay. Now, if you talk to Israelis and how
Mhm.
they view themselves and self describe, this is a completely different universe, right? So, how do these things overlap? And maybe you can speak about that if they even do.
So I think the name of the game, if you're talking about fighting anti-Semitism and winning hearts and minds, the name of the game is not what we think and feel. It's what do the people who we want to persuade think and feel. So whether you're American Jew or you're Israeli, and I did a lot of um, early on advising for MFA and IDF spokespeople and kind of understanding how to speak to media for them. So whoever you are, if your goal and this is, this work is focused on America, but I've had people from a lot of different countries tell me that most of it applies to them too. Western countries, okay?
Yeah.
Um, you should be focused on how do I attune to and understand my audience? That should be the forefront. And so, yes, if you're an Israeli trying to convince Israelis of things, great. Stay in the echo chamber. Perfect. But if you're trying to speak to international media because you're reaching people in Europe or Latin America or America, that's not your focus. That's not your audience.
No, I mean, yes, yeah. Know your audience. Real quick, you mentioned MFA, which means different things to different people. What does that mean in this context?
I'm sorry, Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Okay, thank you. So know your audience. Okay, so here's another. I just want to play. I don't like to use this word, devil's advocate, but
I
anti.
like it.
Okay, okay, devil's advocate for a minute. So you're talking about winning the cultural war, and one school of thought would say, look, anti-Semitism is never going away. It's been here
Mhm,
for thousands of years. As long as there are Jews, there will be anti-Semites, right? So
mhm.
is this battle even worth our energy when we've spent the last 40, 50 years, not fighting the battle which we've been losing, which, the media battle, we haven't been fighting that. We've been building. We've been doing what we're great at. And is our energy better spent doing that, or is this really even a fight worth fighting?
So there's different, I have a couple different answers. So first of all, when we talk about fighting anti-Semitism, there's you can look at reactive or proactive, right? So reactive is like, I'm going to sue the institutions that are doing anti-Semitic things. I'm going to try to get immediate content out there to win the social media battle, right? So that's reactive. And I think that there's a lot of merit in that, right? But then you also have proactive. And that's much more about how do I affect culture so that narratives around Jews or Israel are more favorable. So that's kind of the first thing I'll say is that you can do this in a reactive defensive way where you're just always living hand to mouth, but you can also plan ahead as well. So that's kind of the first answer. The second one, but to your point about anti-Semitism has always been here, it'll always be here. What's the point? Whether you're doing proactive or reactive, whatever the strategy, what's the point of doing that? Here's what I would say. History is this ebb and flow, rise and fall of empires, ebb and flow of, competing human desires between, freedom and order. And you've got societies and politics that kind of go in cycles, right? And you see some anti-Semitism ebb and flow related to these cycles too, right? But throughout time and history, and depending on the context, you can have different you have varying extents of this, right? So like America today is very populist, is going to continue, it's going to grow in terms of populism. Populism is about being angry at a small, corrupt, nefarious elite, which comes with it conspiracy theories, and conspiracy theories are highly correlated to anti-Semitism, right? So you have all of the cultural political ingredients where anti-Semitism is the natural reaction. However, there's different levels of magnitude of how bad that could be, right? So we have what we have today, but you could have a situation where, I mean, I won't specify. I think we can all understand the varying degrees of how this could look. And so this is not about fighting against history and inevitability and these cycles. These cycles are human cycles. We can't fight against that, but the effects could be less prominent, right? It could be that the way this manifests is not quite as acute, or you moderate it in certain ways, you redirect, you create situations where it's more difficult to vilify, it's more difficult to scapegoat, right? And so this is work that can be very frustrating and unsatisfying because you're not going to find a silver bullet, to your point, because this is a symptom of societal dynamics that are inevitable. But we see throughout history and time, there's a difference between exiling or murdering an entire people versus discriminating and having things be really uncomfortable and unfair, right? There's varying degrees of how this can look. And so I would say that it is a thankless struggle that we really don't have an option of not participating in. And we see impact of this. What feels thankless and frustrating is that you can't avoid it entirely, right? You're sort of like you are in a boat with a hole with a bucket where you're chronically dumping the water out, right? There's no way to clog and block the water from coming into the boat. That's true. But like the boat doesn't have to sink, right? You could keep on removing the water. And in different contexts, you would say, okay, well, this is not sustainable. Like just let the boat sink. But that's not an option for us, right? That would be
You
the
could take a
alternative.
plane.
Was that?
You could take a plane.
I mean, that's not I don't, I think that's pretty clear that's not an option. But I would say that because there is this inevitability of it that requires a strong Jewish identity and community, that you don't want to be solely in this reactive defensive space. Because if you are spending all of your time getting the water out of the boat and you don't even care the direction the boat is going toward, what's the
Yeah.
point?
Yeah, nachon, nachon. I mean, I feel like, you and I mean, I lived in America most of my life, but, grew up in this golden age of American Jewry, right? Which some people would argue has ended, right, as of October 2023. And so we did experience a time of thriving and fruition. And so to your point, I was playing devil's advocate for a minute. Of course, I believe the work is valuable and what you're doing is very valuable and that we can make progress. And you have to pace yourself between caring for yourself, caring for your community, and caring for the larger community, and then getting out of the echo chamber and, doing the work. So, okay, today is the fast of Esther, Tanit Esther, which explains why I might have said some funny things along the way. I am fasting. And the holiday of Purim starts tonight. And in the story of Purim, as we know, there were some anti-Semites from Persia, aka Iran, that were trying to kill the Jews. So, has nothing changed in 2,000 years? Are we in this mega cycle? What are your thoughts about Purim as it relates to what's happening right now? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
That's interesting. So, we just talked about the cycle of history and the inevitability and how this shows up differently, but kind of the same each time. So that's obviously true, right? I think, something that actually kind of comes to mind in this story, interestingly enough, is the incredible survivalism of knowing that you have to be close to power centers in order to protect your community. And this is, by the way, one of the things that gets turned into an anti-Semitic trope of Jews being master manipulators and power hungry and things like that, whereas it's really a survivalist strategy. If you don't have the ear to the king, then you actually can't do anything to save your community. So it's just sort of a thought that I had. But in this way, and this was not a perfect solution either, because if I'm remembering this correctly, in the story, it was not that the solution was not to stop Haman from all of this violence. The solution was to arm the Jews to protect themselves, if I'm remembering this correctly. Um, and so that's kind of a similar topic of like, well, there's magnitude difference, right? So depending on how hard you work or how fortunate you are in the work that you're doing, you could get the king just to stop the order. You could get the king to, arm you to defend yourselves. There's a whole range of ways that this could look, right? Depending. And I think that's kind of the name of the game. This is an inevitable cycle. And depending on the environment and context and the ways that we are looking to strategically try to defend ourselves, there can be very different results in terms of what the actual impact is. But the incentive, the vilification, the desire to persecute Jews, that's always going to be there. But our response really mattered in that. There was a lot of impact from that response, right? And it's a bit of a negotiation in some ways, right? Not just negotiation with, the king and power, but like societally, there's a bit of a negotiation of, okay, you are angry at this or you want this to happen. Can we like redirect and tweak a little bit so we can get out alive? Right. And so, but you're right, it is this cycle that keeps repeating itself. It's not always like this. It could be like this. Sometimes it could be like this, or it could be a little more muted. And so the cycle keeps on going, but all of Jews could have been totally wiped out from that same cycle.
Yes, and for those of you listening to the audio, what Toba just did, large hand motions indicating a very wide range of extremes versus medium. So, yeah, that's what she was talking about. So, I also think it's fascinating if you think about Purim chronologically being essentially the last book of the 24 books of the Tanakh, right? And so, and that the fact that Hashem's name is not mentioned in the book explicitly, so it's like, okay, you guys do the work now. I'm going to be here hidden, right? Estar meaning hidden in the background, but you have to actually get on the ground and do it. So, just something to meditate on. Okay, Toba, anything else that by the way, she has a couple brilliant articles on Times of Israel blog. One is about the Jewish response to trauma, and the other is about the war of perception. I'm sure you have more, but do you have any other projects that you're working on at the moment or something coming up you want to tell people about?
Yeah, so I'm working on a book right now. Um, this research that I'm, publishing accessibly to everyone else, that was really important to me. But the book that I'm working on is actually a way for most Americans to understand this through novel form. So basically, the idea is it's very difficult to get people to see some of these concepts when it's too on the nose. And there's something around showing this play out through different characters that you relate to, where you don't really realize they're Jewish at first, or you don't really realize the country they're talking about is Israel at first, where you can kind of suspend reality long enough for people to access this universalist human experience around it. And so that's something I'm working on that basically is a story about the downfall and decay of American society told through the lens of a young woman who is a sociology PhD student who gets put into a mental health institution for watching truths unravel that people have blind spots and dogma around. So the idea is to basically make this work come to life in a way that most Americans could actually digest it.
That sounds amazing. I'm excited to read that. What a brilliant idea. Okay, so my final question, and I definitely would love to go into depth on all of the points that you raised because they're very fascinating, and I want to, I always like to take actionable items out of that. But I always ask every guest that I have on the Holy Sparks podcast, which is, Toba, what does the Jewish world need now most and why?
Introspection. This is a moment, I think this would be a lost moment if it were not used for introspection about how we see ourselves, how other people see us. And I talked about this in my articles, but we have a lot of blind spots. We have a lot of blind spots that are I mean, why do humans have blind spots? We have blind spots to protect ourselves from realities that feel very painful, whether it's because it would require us to change in a way that we're not ready to change in, or it requires us to see something that's terrifying or tragic, right? And so these blind spots, even though we developed them, individually and collectively as an adaptive way for self-protection, they're really not serving us right now. And so I think we need to have a really close look at, we have to have a really close look at what we're seeing and not seeing and refusing to see. And I mean, to me, that's the goal of this research, is that it's calling out those blind spots. But I think it's so easy to, and understandable, to go into self-protection and anger because it's not fair. It's not fair that it's happening. And there's a way in which the ask for Jewish people to, somehow process pain and put it aside in order to help other people understand. It's not a fair ask. It's not a fair ask, and I'm still asking it. It's something that we have to do anyway. And I think it's a burden, but it's an opportunity for so much opening in areas that feel so dark right now. And I know that for me, when I've had to confront my own blind spots during this work, I mean, any good researcher needs to look at their own biases, right? That's such an important part of this. So I had to go through that whole process myself, and it's a grieving process. It is, and a lot of this revolves around what am I believing about the world and what they believe about me that serves how I want to see myself in the world. These are really, really difficult questions, and they're questions that most humans won't ever ask. And this is part of, I think this needs to be part of Jewish exceptionalism, is actually asking these questions.
I love it. Well, I want to end with a blessing, Toba, as I do with all my guests, that Hashem should bless you with continued light and clarity and not only courage for you to look under the own hood of your own life experience, but to, through your work, have other people have the courage to introspect and dig into what is informing their experience and have the courage to, whether it's proactively, reactively, or in any other way, combat the narrative that's been in a tsunami like wave washed over us for multiple decades, and that you should keep up the work because it's someone has to do it, right? That's what leadership is. You're not ready, it's messy, it's not going to be perfect. We are imperfect, flawed heroes, all of us, from Tanakh, from the beginning of our story to right now. That's who we are. And that you're out there modeling doing it really is it a courageous thing. So I applaud you, and I hope that you should have a lot of hatzlacha, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in communities around the world.
Right.
All right. Thank you, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning into this week's episode of the Holy Sparks podcast. And we'll see you next week.